In this video, I'd like to share with you a unique and fascinating insight into London as it was at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. What I hope to do is give viewers, particularly those who might not be familiar with Victorian London, an appreciation of its layout. Our tour is going to take us from Trafalgar Square to Mile End Road, and using historic photographs, we will be able to peruse our surroundings and see them as they would have appeared to those making this same trip in 1888. The route would have been a familiar one to those who were involved in the Jack the Ripper case. Several, if not all of the victims would have walked it oftentimes, and the police detectives from Scotland Yard, who were sent to the East End of London to investigate the crimes, would certainly have been acquainted with it. We will be guided on our expedition by this wonderful book by Herbert Fry, London in 1886, illustrated by 18 bird's-eye views of the principal streets, published 2 years before the Whitechapel murders, which will provide us with an unparalleled understanding of the look of London at the time. As we go, I will tell you of the part played by many of the locations in the story of the crimes, and I'll even show you the exact building where the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. So let's travel back through time to arrive in Trafalgar Square in the year of our Lord, 1888. Trafalgar Square was 44 years old that year. It had been laid out to commemorate the Battle of Trafalgar, fought on the 21st of October 1805 during the Napoleonic Wars, at which the British Navy inflicted a crushing defeat on the French and Spanish fleet and ended the prospect of an invasion by Napoleon's forces once and for all. The victory, however, was tinged with tragedy, as Admiral Nelson, the commander of the fleet, was killed in the battle, so the square remembers his death as well as his victory, and thus a statue of him surmounts Nelson's column at the centre of the square. From its earliest years, Trafalgar Square was a venue for political demonstrations. These increased dramatically in the 1880s when the emerging labour movement, notably the Social Democratic Federation, began holding protest meetings here. On Monday the 8th of February 1886, one such meeting ended in a riot that saw an angry mob rampage through some of the Victorian capital's most respectable and well-heeled streets, looting and pillaging as they went, and leaving a trail of utter destruction in their wake. The fact that the police had been unable to contain the violence sent waves of trepidation reverberating through many middle and upper-class households, and sparked a huge amount of press criticism of the then police commissioner, Sir Edmund Henderson, whose response was to resign. His place was taken by Sir Charles Warren, an ex-military man, who over the next 2 years would demonstrate his mettle and his determination to prevent mob rule from occurring on the streets of London again, by putting down similar unrest with such ruthless efficiency that the radical press would turn against him and would use the Jack the Ripper murders and the police's inability to catch the perpetrator to attack him on an almost daily basis throughout the autumn of 1888. By the summer of 1887, Trafalgar Square had become the night refuge for hundreds of homeless men, women and children who, according to the Times, stretched down on the flags to sleep. No one who has actually seen the square after night, the article thundered, can realise the horrible aspect, which is a perfect outrage upon decency. The square itself is in a most filthy state, and there, huddled up against each other, lie hundreds of the most wretched and miserable creatures. On Monday, October the 23rd, 1887, Sir Charles Warren issued an order that the homeless were to vacate the square, and those who ignored it were arrested and charged with wandering abroad without any visible means of sustenance. One of those taken into custody that night was Mary Ann Nichols, who, according to newspaper reports, didn't go quietly, as she was described as the worst woman in the square, and her behaviour at the police station was said to have been very disorderly. It isn't certain whether this was the Mary Nichols who within a year would become the first of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, but if it was, we get a brief glimpse of her in the 12 months leading up to her death. In early November, the Home Secretary, Sir Henry Matthews, granted a request from Sir Charles Warren to ban protest meetings from being held in the square. The Metropolitan Radical Federation decided to challenge the ban, and they duly called a public meeting in Trafalgar Square, ostensibly to demand the release of several Irish politicians, which was to take place at 2:30 p.m. on Sunday the 13th of November. The stage was set for a showdown, and when it came, it was a bloody and violent one. Thousands of protesters converged on the square that Sunday afternoon, and Warren, determined to enforce the Home Secretary's order, deployed 2,000 constables two deep in a ring around the square, whilst a further 3,000, some on horseback, were kept in readiness in the side streets, along with a battalion of Grenadier Guard foot soldiers and a regiment of mounted lifeguards. Inevitably, violence flared, and the police put it down with such ruthless and indiscriminate force that the day was soon being referred to as Bloody Sunday. Since many of the protesters were from the unemployed masses in the East End of London, the upper and middle classes began casting nervous glances in its direction, fearful that a revolution was about to come out of its teeming streets and miasmic slums. Thus, when less than a year later the Whitechapel murders occurred in the very heart of that district, Jack the Ripper became the personification of all these middle and upper class nebulous fears, and as a result he frightened people in a way that no murderer had done in the past and no murderer would ever do again. Trafalgar Square might not have been the epicentre of the Jack the Ripper scare, but it was certainly instrumental in creating the mood that led to the murders impacting so dramatically on society at large. Looking northeast across the square, you can see the Church of St. Martin in the Fields, and to the left of it, the National Gallery. This photograph shows the view looking south from the steps of the National Gallery, and you can just make out the clock tower of the Houses of Parliament, better known as Big Ben, in the distance. To the left, past Nelson's Column, is Northumberland Avenue, a relatively new thoroughfare at the time, which had been built between 1874 and 1878, and which was lined by luxury accommodation, including the Victoria and Metropole hotels, and visible directly to the left of Nelson's Column, the 7-storey Grand Hotel, which had opened in 1887. These hotels were extremely popular with wealthy Americans visiting London, although you can't help wondering what the well-heeled guests made of the hundreds of homeless people sleeping rough in the square. Nor, for that matter, what the hundreds of homeless people made of the hundreds of affluent tourists sleeping in luxury they could only imagine in the Grand and other hotels. According to Herbert Fry, the opening of Northumberland Avenue, providing as it did direct access to the Victoria Embankment, another recent addition to London's cityscape, had made for a faster journey time for those heading east. As he puts it in our guide, it is said that, whereas the average time occupied by a hansom cab in travelling from Charing Cross to the Mansion House by way of the Strand is 22 minutes, the journey by the Embankment takes but 12 minutes. However, a hansom cab would have been well beyond the means of your average Victorian East Ender, so Shanks's pony or on foot would have been his or hers mode of travel, and the Embankment, although quicker and more picturesque, would deny us the visual feasts that the route via Strand offers, and so we shall suppress the temptation to aim our gait along Northumberland Avenue, and instead set off at a relaxed pace along West Strand, where almost immediately we arrive outside Charing Cross Station, directly in front of which is the Charing Cross itself. The Charing Cross was the largest and most ornate of 12 Eleanor crosses that Edward I had constructed between Lincoln and London to commemorate the overnight halting places of the funeral cortege of his wife, Eleanor of Castile, following her death in November 1290. Her final resting place before her burial in Westminster Abbey was the village of Charing, and the cross constructed here was a major medieval landmark. However, the Queen Eleanor Memorial Cross that can be seen in this photograph, and which is taller than the original, dates only from 1864, when it was built to celebrate the opening of Charing Cross Railway Station, on the forecourt of which it stands. Setting off in an easterly direction, we pass on the right the corner of Villiers Street, and 2 turnings further along on the right is the very narrow George Court, which stretches down to the Adelphi Quarter, beneath which were the Adelphi Arches, where a whole community of homeless and criminally inclined were wont to spend the night. On the opposite side of the Strand, from the entrance to George Court, is the Charing Cross Hospital. Having passed Bedford Street and Adam Street, on the left we come to the Adelphi Theatre, which, according to Herbert Fry, was a well-known and popular house of entertainment, first built in 1806 and rebuilt in 1858. The theatre had undergone a restoration that year and had reopened on the 18th of July with the play The Union Jack, which was staged there for the rest of the year and which starred the Victorian heartthrob actor William Terrace in the title role of Jack Medway. 9 years later, Terrace himself would meet an untimely end when he was stabbed to death outside the stage door of the theatre on Maiden Lane on the 16th of December 1897. A few doors further east from the Adelphi was the Vaudeville Theatre, where on Monday the 24th of September 1888, Thomas Thorne and his company had opened in Joseph's Sweetheart. Looking across Strand, on the other side you can see what appears to be an area of wasteland, behind which is the Savoy Theatre. This theatre was truly state-of-the-art, as in 1881 it had become the first public building in the world to be lit completely by electricity. It was under the proprietorship of the impresario Richard D'Oyly Carte, who staged the ever-popular Gilbert and Sullivan operettas here throughout the 1880s. From July to September 1888, the Mikado was playing here, and then from October, a new operetta, The Yeoman of the Guard, opened. Such were the profits from the productions that D'Oyly Carte was able to purchase the prime real estate alongside the theatre, and on it, in 1888, was building the Savoy Hotel, which would open the following year. This advert for it dates from November 1889, and as you can see, it offered guests the perfection of luxury and comfort, electric lights everywhere at all hours of night and day, and absolutely no gas. Continuing our eastward trajectory, we pass on the left Exeter Hall, which in the latter half of the 19th century was the headquarters of the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA. The hall's auditoriums were used for public lectures and prayer meetings, and at the height of the Jack the Ripper murders, several talks were given here with a view to highlighting the conditions for the poor in the East End of London. Moving on, we pass Burley Street and come to the pit entrance for the Lyceum Theatre, outside which, in this photograph, a queue of men and women are awaiting admission. On Saturday the 4th of August 1888, the actor Richard Mansfield opened at the Lyceum in the stage adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's shilling shocker, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Although the reviews of the play weren't exactly enthusiastic, everybody was impressed with Richard Mansfield's onstage transformation from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde and back again. 3 days after the play's opening, the body of Martha Tambram was found in George Yard off Whitechapel Road. Then, on August the 31st, Mary Nichols was murdered, followed by Annie Chapman on the 8th of September, and newspapers began to wonder if a real-life Mr. Hyde might not be loose on the streets of London's East End. Soon, the advertisements for the play were being blamed for having inspired the Whitechapel murderer in his reign of terror, and in early October, a correspondent actually wrote to the City of London police to point the finger of suspicion at Richard Mansfield himself. I've made a full video on Jekyll, Hyde and Jack the Ripper, and I'll put a link to it in the description below. However, we have too much ground to cover to linger at the theatre, and so we'll leave our eager queuers at the Lyceum and head past the Gaiety Theatre, Catherine Street and Somerset House towards the church of St. Mary-le-Strand. Looking at this image, you can see Somerset House to the right. To the left of the church is an extremely narrow thoroughfare that no longer exists. This was Holywell Street, which was obliterated between 1902 and 1904 when Aldwych was built. We could at this point pass to the right of St. Mary's and continue along Strand, but since Holywell Street was also known as Booksellers' Row on account of the number of bookshops located there, I think a detour is called for, so let's set off along it. Oh yes, I forgot to mention that it wasn't just any old booksellers that Holywell Street was renowned for. No siree. In fact, this narrow, short, nondescript byway was infamous as the centre for indecent literature and images throughout the 19th century, and one estimate put the number of purveyors of pornography located here at 57, so there was evidently a demand. An idea of the extent of what one newspaper described as obscene books, prints, photographs, and other things so vile they cannot for decency's sake be described that were to be found here can be gleaned from a report that appeared in the South London Chronicle on the 25th of March 1871, following a raid by the Society for the Suppression of Vice on the booksellers of Holywell Street, during which they seized 134,760 obscene prints, pictures and photographs, 16,912 books and pamphlets, 5 tons of letterpress in sheets, 17,060 sheets of obscene songs, catalogues, circulars and handbills, 5,696 cards, engraved copper and steel plates, 430 lithographic stones, woodblocks, printing presses with all the type and apparatus for printing, and a number of stereotype plates of works of the vilest description. So moving through Holywell Street at a brisk pace, oi, eyes straight that gentleman at the back, we emerge red-faced and blinking to be confronted by the splendid bulk of the Church of St. Clement Danes. But before we pass it, let's look back at the entrances to Holywell Street, seen here on the left, and at the equally ancient, though less infamous, Wych Street, seen on the right, another ancient street lined with decidedly decrepit houses and buildings. Given Holywell Street's links to the pornographic trade and its proximity to the Church of St. Clement Danes, its nickname in the 1880s was the backside of St. Clement's. And on that note, I think it's time to move on. Bear with me whilst I just put this plain brown paper bag in my inside pocket. Looking to the left of the Church of St. Clement Danes, you can see the Royal Courts of Justice, another recent addition to the London landscape, built between 1868 and 1881, and which had opened for business on the 11th of January 1882. Moving on and past the Royal Courts of Justice, we approached Temple Bar, which until 1878 had actually been a gateway across the street. By the 1870s, the old gateway had become a notorious obstruction, and it was demolished in 1878. This photograph shows it just before its demolition, after which it was replaced by the Temple Bar Memorial, which was designed by the city architect Sir Horace Jones and unveiled in November 1880. It's at this point that Strand ends and Fleet Street begins, and as we pass it, we leave behind the city of Westminster and enter the City of London. As we pass Chancery Lane on the left, opposite on the right-hand side of Fleet Street stands number 17. At the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, this was a haircutter's and wigmaker's shop run by J. Carter. According to Herbert Fry, it was advertising, without evidence, that it had formerly been the palace of Henry VIII and Cardinal Wolsey, and sure enough, if you look above the second-floor windows, you can see the claim boldly emblazoned. The building itself dates from 1610, and it was originally a tavern called the Prince's Arms. Behind it is the Temple, consisting of Middle Temple and Inner Temple. These are 2 of London's 4 Inns of Court, where barristers have their chambers. It was at number 9 King's Bench Walk in the Inner Temple that Jack the Ripper suspect and qualified barrister, Montague John Druitt, had his chambers. Continuing along Fleet Street, we pass on the left the Church of St. Dunstan in the west, and if we pause just after it, this is what we would have seen in 1888. You can see the side of the church's tower on the left of the photograph, and to its right are the London offices of the People's Journal, People's Friend and Dundee Advertiser, a reminder that Fleet Street was at the time the street of ink, with many of the major newspapers of the day having offices on or around it. A little further along, and we pass the corner of Bouverie Street, where newlyweds William and Mary Nichols lodged for a time following their wedding in 1864. This was the Mary Nichols who would become the first of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper. Having passed Bouverie Street, we can look back again at the section of Fleet Street we have just walked along. On the right is the tower of St. Dunstan's Church, and behind it you can just make out one of the pinnacles atop the Royal Courts of Justice in the distance. Turning to look east once more, we get a wonderful view of St. Paul's Cathedral, which we will be heading past very shortly. On the left is the old Cheshire Cheese, located in Wine Office Court, a hostelry that was 221 years old in 1888, and which is still going strong today, its interior hardly changed, despite the passage of another 136 years since the year of the Jack the Ripper murders. Progressing a little further, we come to the corner of Shoe Lane. It was in Dawes Court, just off Shoe Lane, that Mary Ann Walker was born on the 26th of August, 1845. She would marry William Nichols in the Church of St. Bride's, Fleet Street, which can be seen on the opposite side from Shoe Lane, in 1864, and would become Mary Nichols. Here is this section of Fleet Street as it would have looked towards the end of the 19th century, and St Bride's Church could be accessed via various turns on the right, this one being along St Bride's Lane. The church was bombed in the Second World War, but this is the interior of the church as it was when, on the 16th of January 1864, William Nichols married 18-year-old Mary Walker here. Beyond the church were the offices of Punch magazine, where many of the most readily recognisable images to do with the Jack the Ripper murders were created. Illustrations such as Blind Man's Buff, and perhaps most famous of all, the evocative Nemesis of Neglect. Fleet Street ends at Ludgate Circus, a busy intersection beyond which Ludgate Hill ascends to St Paul's Cathedral. The bridge over the road ahead is the Ludgate Hill Viaduct, constructed in 1865 by the London, Chatham and Dover Railway. To its left is the King Lud pub, which had opened in 1870, and to the right of the giant Bovril sign is the Blackpool Tourist Office, reminiscent of an age when a trip to this northern seaside holiday resort would have been considered the height of glamour for many Londoners. You can see the top of an obelisk to the right in the photograph, but if we change our viewpoint and look towards Ludgate Circus from New Bridge Street, there were in fact two obelisks, one dating from 1775 and the other from 1833. Moving further back along New Bridge Street, but still looking towards Ludgate Circus, on the left are the offices of the Central News Agency, where on the 27th of September 1888 the Dear Boss letter was received. Written in red ink, it purported to have been sent by the Whitechapel murderer, and it gloated over his atrocities thus far and warned that he loved his work and wanted to start again. The letter was signed Jack the Ripper, and once this missive was made public in early October 1888, it turned a series of sordid East End murders into an international phenomenon and catapulted the unknown miscreant responsible for them into the realm of legend. So it could be argued that New Bridge Street was the birthplace of Jack the Ripper. I've made a full video on the Dear Boss letter, and I'll put a link to it in the description down below. Our route now takes us up Ludgate Hill towards St Paul's Cathedral. On the left we pass the street Old Bailey, where is located the Central Criminal Court, or as it is better known, the Old Bailey. It was here that the trials of 4 people whose names have been put forward as possible contenders for the mantle of Jack the Ripper took place. These were James Kelly in August 1883 for the murder of his wife Sarah, Mary Piercy in December 1890 for the murder of Phoebe Hogg and her baby daughter, Thomas Neal Cream in October 1892 for the wilful murders of Alice Marsh, Ellen Donworth, Emma Shrivel and Matilda Clover, and Severine Klosowski, alias George Chapman, in March 1903 for the murder of his wife, Maud Marsh. Chapman was also charged with the murders of his 2 previous wives, Mary Isabella Spink and Elizabeth Bessie Taylor. All of them were found guilty and sentenced to death. In the case of James Kelly, however, his sentence was commuted on the grounds of insanity, and he was sent to Broadmoor Asylum, from which he escaped in January 1888, hence his inclusion on the list of possible suspects. He remained at large until February 1927, when he turned up at Broadmoor and asked to be readmitted. His wish was granted, and he died there on the 17th of September 1929. Next to the court stands Newgate Prison, and it was here that Mary Piercy was executed on Tuesday the 23rd of December 1890. Thomas Neal Cream was executed at the prison on the 15th of November 1892. The executioner in his case was James Billington, who later claimed that Cream's last words as the trap fell were, "I am Jack the..." No one else present mentioned Cream having said such a thing as he plunged to his death, but it is on the basis of these supposed last words that his name features on the list of Jack the Ripper suspects. George Chapman, on the other hand, was executed at Wandsworth Prison. Returning to Ludgate Hill, we continue our ascent towards St Paul's Cathedral. Running parallel with this section to the right is Carter Lane, where in 1891 Jacob Cohen and Wolfe Abrahams were in business together at number 51. Abrahams was the brother-in-law of Major Jack the Ripper suspect Aaron Kosminski. Cohen was a lay witness to Kosminski's state of mind before he was committed to Colney Hatch Asylum, and he stated that he goes about the streets and picks up bits of bread out of the gutter and eats them. He drinks water from the tap, and he refuses food at the hands of others. He took up a knife and threatened the life of his sister. He is very dirty and will not be washed. He has not attempted any kind of work for years. That brings us to St. Paul's Cathedral, and at this point we shall pause, turn round and take a look down Ludgate Hill at the route we have just walked along. At this point we have a choice. We can either pass to the left of St. Paul's Cathedral, or we can pass to its right. We shall opt for the latter and make our way past the south side of the cathedral to the right. This is the view as it would have appeared in 1888, and you can see the south portico of St. Paul's Cathedral to the left. Continuing along Cannon Street, we come to a divide in the road, where we take the left fork onto Queen Victoria Street. To the left of the junction is the Church of St. Mary, Aldermary, and this photograph shows the section of Queen Victoria Street along which we are making our way as it would have appeared in the 1880s. Weaving our way between and around the handcarts, barrows and horse-drawn vehicles, and dodging the surging tide of humanity, we pass the corner of Queen Street and forge our way along the remainder of Queen Victoria Street to arrive at the even busier Bank Junction. Crossing this intersection in Victorian times was, to say the least, a challenge. You had to keep a keen eye peeled as you threaded your way through the traffic, with horse-drawn carriages, barrows and omnibuses coming at you from all directions, all of them in the photographs seemingly oblivious to the dozen or so brave or foolhardy pedestrians who are striding boldly between them. Top hats and bowlers abound, and the few ladies sitting on the upper decks of the omnibuses are attired in bonnets and shawls. The statue on horseback directly ahead is of the Duke of Wellington, and the building behind him, with the columns and pediment, is the Royal Exchange, whilst to the left of it is the Bank of England, seen here before its rebuilding in the early 20th century. If we dare to take a few steps into the traffic and turn to look back, this is the view we would have enjoyed. To the left is the Mansion House, the home of the Lord Mayor of the City of London throughout his 1 year in office. The Lord Mayor's tenure runs from November to November, and on the 9th of November each year, the new Lord Mayor was shown to the citizens of London with the Lord Mayor's Show, a day of pageantry marked with a splendid street parade that was enjoyed by Londoners across the social spectrum, although the day wasn't, as is often claimed, a public holiday. The murder of Mary Kelly took place on Friday the 9th of November, the day of the Lord Mayor's Show that year, and according to Elizabeth Prater, who occupied the room over Mary's in Miller's Court, Mary had told her the previous evening that she hoped the Friday would be fine, as she wanted to go to the Lord Mayor's Show. The Lord Mayor when the Jack the Ripper murders began, in August 1888, was Sir Polydore de Keyser, and on the 2nd of October it was reported in the newspapers that the Lord Mayor, Mr. Polydore de Keyser, after consulting Sir James Fraser, Chief Commissioner of the Police of the City of London, announced that a reward of £500 would be given by the corporation for the detection of the miscreant. A year later, while sitting as a magistrate at the Guildhall Police Court in December 1889, de Keyser fined Jack the Ripper suspect Aaron Kosminski 10 shillings for having an unmuzzled dog on the streets, although obviously he wasn't a suspect at the time. De Keyser's year in office ended on Thursday the 8th of November 1888, and the next day the new Lord Mayor, Sir James Whitehead, succeeded him. It was his Lord Mayor's Show that was interrupted by the breaking news of Mary Kelly's murder, when, according to the next day's edition of the Dundee Courier, the tens of thousands of persons who had assembled along the line of the route from the city to the West End to watch the civic pageant pass were startled and horrified by the hoarse cries of the street newspaper hawkers announcing the perpetration of another terrible murder in Whitechapel. Looking beyond the Mansion House, the Mappin and Webb building can be seen directly ahead. To its left is Queen Victoria Street, along which we have just strolled, and to its right is Poultry, leading into Cheapside, on which you can see the spire of the Church of St. Mary-le-Strand. It was on Cheapside that Aaron Kosminski was arrested by Police Constable Bora, who duly issued him with a summons to appear at the Guildhall Court. Cheapside was also the favoured pitch for hawking cheap trinkets, menthol cones, needles and pins of the second Whitechapel murders victim, Martha Tabram. But now we turn our gaze back to the east and head across the intersection, seen here in 1880, and pass to the right of the Duke of Wellington's statue onto Cornhill. Again, this is a busy and vibrant thoroughfare. The bowler and top-hatted gentlemen have fixed stares on their faces as they make their way to their places of work, or possibly, depending on the time of day the photo was taken, to a long liquid lunch of the sort city workers used to enjoy in the taverns and restaurants that were liberally scattered along Cornhill and in the various alleyways that run off it. Notice the small group of ladies sitting by the railings around the Duke of Wellington's statue, selling flowers, both real and artificial, as well as other trinkets to the passing city gents. Undoubtedly, these ladies are from the East End, and the one on the far right appears to have interested a passing top-hatted gentleman in her wares, although I can't help wondering what he has in the black bag he is carrying. Just saying. The omnibuses to the right are heading eastwards towards Aldgate and beyond, and it would save us a considerable amount of time if we were to jump on board to complete our journey, but then we'd miss out on the wonders of Cornhill, so I think we'll continue on foot. Oh dear, that police officer in the foreground appears to be taking quite an interest in us. Perhaps it's time to stop people watching and begin our stroll along Cornhill. As we pass the Royal Exchange, on the right is Pope's Head Alley, a narrow and ancient city byway that is named for the Pope's Head Tavern that once stood here. This view is looking along it towards Cornhill. A little further along on the right of Cornhill, we pass Birch & Co., a famed confectioners and caterers, the shopfront from which dates from the early 1800s, and which in 1886 was hailed as probably the oldest shop of its kind in the city. We continue past the corners of Birchin Lane on the right, Finch Lane on the left, and the churches of St. Michael and St. Peter on the right, bringing us to the junction of Cornhill and Gracechurch Street. Here we shall pause and look back along the route we have just taken. The spire of St. Peter's Church can be seen in the foreground, and the tower of St. Michael's is visible in the distance. The corner at which we are standing is another busy intersection, and I don't know about you, but I'd love to be able to eavesdrop on the conversations the various groups of bystanders are sharing. Oh, but wait. Now this policeman's taking an interest in us. This is bordering on harassment, so let's hurry across the junction and set off along Leadenhall Street, passing on the right the approach to Leadenhall Market, which had been rebuilt in the early 1880s. According to a contemporary account, Leadenhall Market was for the sale of meat, poultry and livestock. Among the latter are rabbits, fowls, dogs, goats and vigorous cats, which latter are greatly in demand for long voyages in rat-haunted ships and for warehouses infested with rats and mice. Continuing along Leadenhall Street, we pass St. Mary Axe, St. Andrew's Undershaft and St. Catherine Cree churches, at which point we can pause and look back along Leadenhall Street in the direction we have come from. Turning to head east once more, we arrive at the Aldgate Pump, which traditionally marked the point at which the City of London gave way to the East End of London. The pump was still in use as a source of water for the passing public in 1888, and was such an important landmark that local businesses would advertise their locations according to their proximity to it. Despite a brief scare in the 1870s, when it was discovered that the renowned taste of its water was due to its being polluted with sewage and the remains of decomposing former parishioners in the nearby churchyard through which it filtered, the pump was still popular at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, albeit its supply by this time came courtesy of the New River Water Company. It remained a popular meeting point with EastEnders, and William Turner, the paramour of Martha Tabram, last saw her alive when he met her by the Aldgate Pump on the afternoon of Saturday the 4th of August, 1888. She told him that she had no money, so he gave her 1 shilling and 6pence so that she could purchase some stock to sell on the streets and earn a few halfpence. He later estimated that they chatted by the pump for around 20 minutes, and once he had given her the money, they went their separate ways. He would never see her alive again. To the left is a nondescript enclosed square, which Herbert Fry in 1886 didn't even consider worth mentioning by name, as it would be another 2 years before Mitre Square would become infamous throughout the world as the scene of the murder of Catherine Eddowes in the early hours of Sunday the 30th of September, 1888. Moving ahead onto Aldgate, which morphs into Aldgate High Street a little further along, we come to the Church of St. Botolph, opposite which is Minories, where Jack the Ripper suspect Thomas Cutbush was employed for a time as a clerk and traveller in the tea trade. This photograph of St. Botolph's Church was taken in 1892, and this one shows its churchyard in 1882. These girls, who give every impression of really enjoying themselves, are posing for the camera just a little to the east of St. Botolph's Church, and just past them in the late 19th century stood the Three Nuns Hotel. It was at the Three Nuns, on the night over which the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes took place, that Albert Backett, who would later become the self-appointed president of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, claimed to have met a suspicious-looking man who was carrying a shiny black bag, who questioned him at some length about the habits of the prostitutes of the district. This view shows the north side of Aldgate High Street, and it was on the stretch of pavement beyond, on the evening of Saturday the 29th of September, 1888, that Police Constable Louis Robinson arrested Catherine Eddowes for drunkenness and took her into custody at Bishopsgate Police Station. She was released at 1 a.m. on the 30th of September, 45 minutes before Constable Watkins found her horribly mutilated body in Mitre Square. In Victorian times, the section of Aldgate High Street opposite the station was known as Butcher's Row, on account of the proliferation of butchers' shops and stalls located on it. Following his retirement in 1905, several newspapers reported that Inspector Robert Sagar of the City of London Police had stated in an interview that the City Police fully believed that Jack the Ripper was a butcher who worked in Butcher's Row and who was partly insane. It is believed, stated the Gloucester Citizen, that he made his way to Australia and there died. And so we come to the end of Aldgate High Street. Looking back along it, Butcher's Row is to the left, and just before it is a pub which still exists today, the Hoop and Grapes. At this point, our companion thus far, Herbert Fry, abandons us, as for some reason he doesn't appear to have considered Whitechapel worth featuring on a bird's-eye map. So I'm going to have to dig out George Washington Bacon's map of London from 1890, and he will guide us on the last leg of our journey. Just a quick warning, folks, we are about to enter what the American author Jack London termed the Abyss, a part of the Victorian metropolis that was renowned for its poverty, vice, violence and drunkenness, so make sure your pockets are firmly shut and keep a keen eye peeled for any lurking ne'er-do-wells as we step over the boundary and enter the East End proper. Immediately to the left is Middlesex Street, formerly known as Petticoat Lane, the scene of a thriving Sunday market. Here are a few scenes from said market in the late 19th century, just to give you a flavour of it. It's worth remembering that every one of the people you see in these photographs lived through the Jack the Ripper scare, and who knows, one of them may even have been Jack the Ripper himself. The boundary between the City of London and Whitechapel runs along Middlesex Street, and significantly it is here that the jurisdiction of the City of London Police ends and that of the Metropolitan Police begins. 36 Middlesex Street was the home of Jack the Ripper suspect, butcher Jacob Levy, whose mental health declined severely following the death of his mother in May 1888. In August 1890, he was admitted to the City of London Lunatic Asylum in Stone, Kent, and, according to the asylum records, his wife stated that he had been suffering with mania for some time, feared that if he was not restrained he would do some violence to someone, and did not sleep at nights but wandered around aimlessly for hours. Continuing along Whitechapel High Street, the next left is Goulston Street. It was in the doorway of a tenement block on the right of this street that the graffito, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," was found scrawled in chalk in the early hours of the 30th of September, 1888. Beneath it was a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron covered in blood and gore, which led to the belief that the message had been scrawled by the Whitechapel murderer as he fled the scene of his Mitre Square atrocity, using a torn piece of his victim's apron to wipe the blood from his hands. I've made a full video on the Goulston Street graffito, and I'll put a link to it below. But for now, we shall return to Whitechapel High Street, and this photograph shows the section along which we are now walking. Gorton & Sons at 146 Whitechapel High Street was, as its sign declares, a specialist veterinary chemist and wholesale druggist, a necessary trade at the time since all vehicles were dependent on horses to pull them, and the equine memorabilia displayed in the shop window is testimony to their main clientele. The building sports a large golden sun, the emblem of the Apothecaries Company, symbolic of the healing power of Apollo. The photograph actually dates from the early 1890s, by which time the building next door had become Taylor and Tasty's Coffee Bar, its upper floors advertising a hotel for gentlemen. In 1888, the building was occupied by various clothing manufacturers or sweatshops. Next door to that is the original entrance to Aldgate East Underground Station, which had opened in 1884. Once the station had opened, Edward Topless acquired the surplus land behind it and built his tobacco factory on the site. The next turning left on Whitechapel High Street is Castle Alley, and it was here that the body of Alice Mackenzie was found by Constable Andrews at around 1 o'clock on the morning of Wednesday the 17th of July, 1889, leading to newspaper speculation that Jack the Ripper had returned. Continuing east along this western section of Whitechapel High Street, we come on the left to Commercial Street, which, it could be argued, was central to the saga of the Whitechapel murders. 5 of the murders, those of Emma Smith, Martha Tabram, Annie Chapman, Mary Kelly and Alice Mackenzie, took place in thoroughfares running off or adjacent to it, whilst the majority of the victims were living in the side streets on either side of it at the times of their deaths. So Commercial Street is connected in one way or another to all the Whitechapel murders. Returning to its junction with Whitechapel High Street, on the opposite side is Leman Street, where was located Leman Street Police Station, the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police's H Division, to whom fell the task of investigating the majority of the Whitechapel murders. But now we continue our easterly trajectory along Whitechapel High Street. This view along it dates from the late 1890s, and in the distance can be seen St Mary's Church. In the Middle Ages, its original predecessor had been a lime-washed building, making it a striking white local landmark that was given the nickname the White Chapel. In time, that sobriquet would pass to the district that grew up around the church, and it became known as Whitechapel. Continuing, we pass on the left the entrance to George Yard, where Martha Tabram was murdered on the 7th of August 1888. She and a friend of hers, Mary Ann Connolly, better known as Pearly Poll, had met 2 soldiers in one of the pubs of the district the previous night, and at midnight the 4 had split into couples. Pearly Poll took her soldier into Angel Alley, named for the old Angel Inn that can be seen in this photograph of the north side of the High Street, whilst Martha Tabram had taken her soldier into George Yard, where her body was discovered on the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings a little before 5 a.m. by waterside labourer John Saunders Reeves as he came down the stairs on his way to work. It was in the cellar of the White Hart pub to the left of the entrance of George Yard that Jack the Ripper suspect Severin Klosowski, alias George Chapman, worked as a barber in 1890. Whitechapel High Street ends just before St Mary's Church, where on the left is Osborne Street. It was on this corner that Ellen Holland met a very drunk Mary Nichols at 2:30 on the morning of Friday the 31st of August 1888. An hour or so earlier, Mary had been ejected from a common lodging house on nearby Thrall Street because she didn't have the 4pence to pay for a bed. Leaning against the shutters of the shop on the right corner of Osborne Street, Mary told Ellen that she had made her lodging house money 3 times that day, but had spent it. Concerned at her friend's intoxicated state, Ellen tried to persuade Mary to come back to the lodging house with her, but Mary refused, saying that she had no money and that she must make up the cost of her lodgings. Her last words to Ellen were, "It won't be long before I'll be back," and straightening herself, she tottered to the corner, turned left, and Ellen watched her stagger off unsteadily along Whitechapel Road. Other than her killer, Ellen Holland was, as far as could be ascertained, the last person to see Mary Nichols alive. Following Mary along Whitechapel Road, we pass St Mary's Church. At around 1:30 a.m. on Tuesday the 3rd of April 1888, a 45-year-old widow by the name of Emma Elizabeth Smith was passing the church on her way back to her lodging house in nearby George Street when she noticed a group of men coming towards her. Something about them evidently disturbed her, and having crossed over Whitechapel Road to avoid them, she scurried along Osborne Street. The men followed her, and having caught up with her, they subjected her to a brutal and savage attack, inflicting injuries that were so terrible and severe that she would die from them on the morning of Wednesday the 4th of April, and become the first name on the generic Whitechapel murders file. Having passed St Mary's Church, on the right behind it is Mulberry Street, where at number 22, Sergeant William Thick arrested John or Jack Pizer on the morning of the 10th of September 1888 and took him to Leman Street Police Station, maintaining that Pizer was the man known in the district as Leather Apron, who was wanted on suspicion of having carried out the murders that had taken place up to that date. However, Pizer was able to provide cast iron alibis for his whereabouts on the nights of the murders and was soon ruled out as a suspect. Just beyond that is Greenfield Street, from where on the 4th of February 1891 suspect Aaron Kosminski was taken to Mile End Old Town Workhouse Infirmary, where he was certified insane and transferred to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. A little further along Whitechapel Road, and we pass number 215, which by 1888 had become infamous as the location where in September 1874 brushmaker Henry Wainwright had murdered his lover Harriet Lane and buried her beneath the floor of the premises. A year later, mounting debts forced him to sell the building, and so he exhumed her body with a view to reburying it at a premises in Southwark on the south side of the River Thames. Unfortunately for Wainwright, Alfred Stokes, whose help he enlisted to move the heavy parcels in which he had placed the dismembered parts of Harriet's body, became suspicious, opened one of the parcels, and alerted the police, who arrested Wainwright as he was about to carry Harriet's remains into the new premises. Wainwright was found guilty of her murder and was executed at Newgate Prison on the morning of December the 21st, 1875. So notorious was his crime that, had you mentioned the Whitechapel murder or Whitechapel murderer to someone prior to 1888, it would have been the murder of Harriet Lane by Henry Wainwright that they would have presumed you were talking about. Opposite stood the Pavilion Theatre, and just past it was the corner of Baker's Row, where Charles Cross and Robert Paul alerted Police Constable Mizzen to the fact they had found the body of Mary Nichols in nearby Bucks Row. Moving along this final section of Whitechapel Road, on the right is the London Hospital, where Emma Smith died on Wednesday the 4th of April 1888, and where the inquest into her death was held. James Sadler, who was arrested for the murder of possible Ripper victim Francis Coles, which took place on Friday the 13th of February 1891, was treated at the London Hospital for injuries he sustained from being mugged on the night of her death, and fellow Ripper suspect Robert Donston Stevenson was hospitalised here between July and December 1888. On the opposite side of Whitechapel Road is Whitechapel Station, which had opened in February 1884, and next to that is the Working Lads Institute, where the inquests into the deaths of Martha Tabram, Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman, Alice Mackenzie and Francis Coles were held. Behind it is Bucks Row, where Charles Cross found the body of Mary Nichols, the first victim, on the morning of Friday, August the 31st, 1888. Continuing along the final section of Whitechapel Road, we pass on the left number 152, the home of Dr. Ralph Llewellyn, the medic who was brought to the scene of Mary Nichols's murder, and who pronounced life extinct before ordering that the body be taken to the Whitechapel Workhouse mortuary, where the horrific abdominal injuries were discovered. Crossing the junction with Cambridge Heath Road, we come to the waste at the start of the Mile End Road, and it is here we end our journey outside the far-famed Vine Tavern. So let's pop inside, rest our weary feet and enjoy a well-earned libation in a pub that was destined to be demolished in the early 20th century. I hope you've enjoyed our journey through London as it was at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, and if you have, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Anyway, I'm just going to jump aboard this passing horse bus that seems to have appeared out of nowhere, and make my way back to the Lyceum Theatre, as I have tickets for the night's performance of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It'll make a nice change. So now you must suffer me to go my own dark way. Move over, and please take that black bag off the seat, sir.